Welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast for women on leadership and life skills with Rhea Story.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast episode on Can Leadership Be Learned? This topic is interesting because it's one of the more frequently asked questions that I get when I talk to people about what it is that I do, that Mac and I do together. You know, I often say that we have his, mine, and ours in terms of we both teach leadership and personal growth, but we teach that in his lane of blue collar leadership and my lane focusing more on leadership of self, leadership for women, helping leaders lead themselves better. So we kind of have his mind, but most of the time we talk together. So that means it's his mind and ours, because most of the time we speak together. The principles are the same, but the stories that we share obviously will change depending on the environment or the audience or things like that. So anyway, but when I share with someone what it is that I do, a lot of times one of the questions that someone asks is, can leadership actually be learned? Can leadership be taught to someone? And I think a lot of times that's not a bad question. It just shows probably a lack of awareness of what the definition of leadership really is. I think a lot of us think that leadership is just something you either have, you're born with, it's genetic, or you don't have it. And a lot of times I was one of those people. I thought leadership is for the boss or the manager of a company or the CEO, but leadership wasn't for me, right? I didn't think of the definition of leadership. And so I didn't realize that leadership absolutely could apply to me. So when we define leadership as influence, the way John Maxwell defines leadership as influence, we realize that number one, all of us have some influence. And number two, we all want more influence. We think of any time in life when we're mad or sad or upset or frustrated. I guarantee you it's because we wanted more influence in that situation and we didn't have as much as we wanted. And so when we realize that everybody has some influence, all of us want more influence, but realizing that we can create more influence, we can build more influence in a relationship with a certain specific person, because we can be intentional about building the relationship, building trust in the relationship, and leadership is based on the relationships. Relationships are built on the trust. So if you can increase trust in the relationship, you can gain influence. Now, there are going to be a few people that you just cannot influence because you don't have shared mutual values, right? A fundamental difference of values. And that means you're not going to have a lot of influence because there's no shared foundation based on values. But most of the time, we can increase our influence. We just simply have to be intentional about doing so. And it means taking responsibility for how I first lead myself, because that's going to change how I interact with someone else. And so we're back to the question of, can leadership really be learned? Can you learn to do that? Absolutely. Influencing people is a skill. Now, here's the critical difference. We have to be very careful that we're not developing that skill in order to manipulate people better. That is not high character leadership. That's manipulation of people. And we have to be careful that we're not trying to increase our influence simply so we can get something from the other person that will help us, but may come at their expense, right? So being very careful about the underlying intent, because if you're trying to manipulate someone, you're not going to be able to really increase your influence very much for very long. You might could fool them for a little while, but sooner or later, people will feel that. So absolutely, leadership is something that can be learned. And the thing about it, though, is Mac and I can talk leadership principles all day long and teach them in a training session or speak about them or read about or write about them in a book. You can learn about leadership and increasing your influence in a session, reading a book, listening to a conference speaker. You can learn about leadership, but you cannot learn it until you actually go apply it, until you go practice it, until you go, like any skill, right? So absolutely, just like any other skill, we can learn to do it and we can learn to do it better, but we can't learn to do it better until we actually do it. It would be like if I gave you a book about tennis and you read that whole book about tennis and then you went and watched some videos on how to play tennis and you learned some of the rules about tennis. At some point, if you want to be a tennis player, you're going to have to get out and actually go pick up a racket and play tennis, right? You can learn about something, but you cannot learn it until you do it, until you make the effort. You didn't learn to walk until you started trying to walk. So, absolutely, leadership can be taught, it can be learned. Every single one of us have the potential to do the things and make the choices that will help us increase our leadership. I think it does. I think some of the qualities that help us give us sort of a head start in leadership come a little more intuitively to some people than others. And perhaps that's what people mean. A lot of times when they ask that question, maybe they mean that, uh, noticing that some inherent qualities or character traits will help you in influence and leadership. And some of us have those to a greater degree or lesser degree naturally. There's nothing wrong with that, right? None of us were fundamentally flawed because we have some of the characteristics of leadership differently than someone else. Because I think all of us have that potential to increase those abilities. And what could be a great leadership quality in someone might be not as strong of a quality in someone else's character, but they have some other quality that helps them with leadership and influence. So, for example, I tend to be a little more of a listener. Just naturally, I tend to be more of a listener than a talker. And that can be a great asset in influencing people. Now, if you're a great talker, if you're just a normal, natural born, love to be the one speaking person, that can also be a great attribute as a leader. It's just a different quality than listening. So, someone who is naturally more talkative is not going to have as much of a natural listening attribute. And so they have to be careful to develop those skills where they're not strong. So all of us have some areas we're naturally more gifted and some that we're not as strong in. So it's recognizing where our strength areas are and recognizing when it comes to leadership and influence, we have to be intentional about developing the character flaws or the character areas that we are holding us back. So, for example, fairly early on, I knew that I wasn't like the natural talker, for example, that Mac is. Nothing wrong with that. I tend to be a little more reflective and a little more of a listener and a little less of a just a talker, just an outgoing speaker. And so recognizing that, I had to be intentional about being aware of that. Nothing wrong with listening to people, and in times that can be a great way to increase influence. But I have to be intentional about developing that skill at connecting with others by using my words, right? And I have been. So my point here is that yes, while leadership can be learned, we do have to be intentional about learning and developing the qualities and the characteristics that will help us increase our influence. And once we start to become a little more aware, right, raising that level of awareness of those areas that hold us back, then we can just be conscious of working in those. And I've touched on this before, but being very intentional that in our competencies, we want to work on our strengths. Competencies are the skills, knowledge, talents, abilities that we do. Character is the how we do what we do, the who we are as a person, right? So I want to be very intentional about working on my strengths of competency, where I'm gifted at in terms of abilities competencies, knowledge, and skills. Work from your strengths there because you can shine like a star there. But make sure you're addressing areas of weakness in terms of character. And I don't mean that weak in terms of is a bad thing necessarily, but again, recognizing the character traits that you have that are limiting you and your leadership ability, your ability to connect with people, to build influence with other people, right? Recognizing that their weaknesses of character are what's holding us back. So making sure that we work on weaknesses of character, but work from strengths of our competencies. And a lot of times we don't talk about that. Even in our kind of just our society, we say, well, oh gosh, if you're not great in math, then you should study math harder and work more on math, and you can bring that C to a B. But the truth of it is, if you're just not naturally gifted in math, and I'm not, math is just not my favorite thing. It's just not my jam. It doesn't matter if I studied from now for the next 10 years. I'm never going to be super excited and passionate about doing math. I'm not gifted at it. I can do it. I just don't like to. I don't want to. So that's a competency, right? I don't need to spend time trying to improve my math skills because I'm never going to be anything more than mediocre when it comes to math. I need to make sure that in terms of competency, I focus on the things that do help me excel, help me shine, help me be exceptional, right? Nobody gets excited about average. So particularly important when we think about, can leadership be learned? Absolutely. But making sure that you're aware of the areas that you can work on, that you should work on, that will help you be more effective in life and in leadership. Developing those qualities that are limiting you in terms of character. Character is the who we are side of us, right? The how we do what we do is determined by our character, attitude, mindset, integrity. I have an entire list of these attributes to be mindful of. And I talk about this more in depth in the Ladder of Influence, and dig into some of those qualities and just help you, again, raise that level of self-awareness that says, hey, I need to be more intentional in this area so that I can shine in all areas. So absolutely, leadership can be learned, but not until you get out there and actually put it into practice. Until next time.